We finished up by talking about this team process where you go from forming to storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And when we were talking about this, we actually spoke about how these different stages tend to happen almost concurrently, particularly forming, storming, norming, and performing. So what else goes on with a team process? Well, teams generally try to get to the point where they enjoy being around each other, team members anyway. And the degree to which you wish to remain a part of a group or team is called cohesiveness. And that has a lot to do with how you feel about your connection to other people, but also your connection to larger goals that are bigger than yours. Does what the team represent actually reflect who you believe you are yourself? Part of coming up with team cohesiveness, or good team cohesiveness, is the idea of coming up with ways of behaving with each other. And we talked about this when we talked about the idea of norming through the team process. Remember that norms are accepted ways of behaving. And they can be about anything. They can be about ethics. They can be about communication. They could be about whether or not you treat people with respect, or you tend to go with a very negative kind of way of treating them. And norms tend to flow and be created by a number of different things. Situations and how they're handled by leaders, how leaders react to being confronted, all kinds of things like that. Some different ways in which norms are created. Critical events that happen in a team's history, precedents, in other words, what happens first and how it's dealt with, explicit statements by team members that aren't challenged, such as statements that might be very racist or very liberal, carryover from other experiences that you've had with this same team or in dealing with similar situations. All of these things, of course, are heavily influenced by the leader as well, who determines whether or not these things go unchallenged. And if a leader is oblivious to these things going on, that could be even worse. So when you have differences of opinion and differences of an understanding of how values ought to be expressed or what those values are, this can create a lot of team conflict. Now, team conflict actually is very positive in general. Conflict about how to get the work done, that's team process, or what work to do if you have those kinds of choices. That's team content kind of conflict. That's all very positive. You want people to be questioning how you're doing things in order to come up with better ways of doing them. On the other hand, if it's interpersonal or if there's too much conflict, it can lead to a lot of dysfunction. So you have this functional conflict that helps you move ahead with finishing tasks and creating stronger relationships, and this dysfunctional conflict that creates either interpersonal problems or problems in getting the work done. So it's a big balancing act, and leaders have to take an active role in it pretty much 100% of the time. Now, obviously, if you get through your norming and your storming, and the only thing left to do is to do the work, then most of the time this conflict remains very low, unless you purposefully have large levels of conflict in order to continuously question as you enter into new situations, new markets, things like that. Now, not surprisingly, it's not just what you have conflict over, but also who you are that determines the kind of conflict that you encounter and how you handle it. Really, based on personality, there are essentially 5 different styles for handling conflict. Not surprisingly, these styles are also what influences how people negotiate, and negotiating conflict management resolution is a big part of being a manager. So what are the styles? One style is the dominating style. This is where you just try to win the argument, win the moment, no matter what the consequences are as far as long-term effects are concerned. An avoiding style means you essentially try not to get into conflict at all. This can be actually very functional if, for example, somebody is attempting to engage you in some conflict, but you recognize that engaging them would be a very negative thing to do. It brings you down a level, for example. Or if by avoiding some conflict, you're buying yourself time, either to run out a clock on something, such as a deal that's going to run out of time, or if you need to gather more information in order to be able to properly answer somebody's request for confrontation. A compromising style means that you're willing to give up things as long as other people or other groups are willing to give up things in order to come to some kind of a resolution. An accommodating style usually is taken for 2 reasons. One might be simply because you don't like conflict and you just want the other people to be happy, and you're very agreeable as far as that's concerned. You have a high level of agreeableness. On the other hand, You might take on an accommodating style where you're willing to give up quite a bit and just kind of give the person what they want. If, for example, you're trying to salvage a relationship or to maintain a relationship, you don't want to rock the boat on a relationship and simply hand things to people because of the fact that you prefer to do it that way because you know that you're going to need them later. And lastly, you might have a collaborating style, and this is the idea of approaching a problem. Approaching a conflict as though we're a problem to be solved, where two people sit down and say, well, I have this issue and you have this issue, so let's get together and figure out our issues. Now, managing conflict can be tricky, but there are some ways to both manage it and avoid it. One way to avoid it and to get people to move past it quickly is to have these superordinate goals. These are like larger goals than just completing the work in front of you or just an individual completing their own work. Because a conflict is really the perceived or actual interference with somebody achieving their own goal. So if you have a bigger goal that the person has to think of, kind of the forest through the trees kind of thing, like what is the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here, then maybe having these tiny conflicts is something we should just get over. A good example is people who get into a lot of conflict over weddings. A lot of family members back and forth and get angry at each other, but the truth of the matter is the people who are not the bride and groom should be very accommodating of the bride and groom because of the fact that this is their wedding. After all, and people don't realize, unfortunately, bride and grooms quickly realize that the wedding isn't just about them, and that's when things become a problem, particularly in families that have a lot of splits. Mediation, which is another way of dealing with conflict, that is where you end up with a third party who tries to come to some resolution after hearing both parties either separately or together, but it's usually a non-binding resolution. Something, say you get an elder or a boss who comes together, somebody who's been around for a long time, who doesn't have a stake in things going one way or another to help you to resolve an issue. And lastly, you can use negotiation. We have a whole class on negotiation. I highly recommend that you take it at MAN 3611. It's actually cross-cultural communication and negotiation, and it's extremely exciting. We have a lot of fun with it. Negotiation can be integrative or distributive by nature, and usually is a combination of both with protracted negotiations. That is, negotiations that deal with multiple issues. So for example, integrative negotiation, you take on the idea that you need to create value for both parties or all parties involved with the negotiation. So if you have a conflict and I have a conflict, with you, we might sit down and say, how can we make this so that not only our conflicts go away, but we get the most out of the situation? And I might even create more value for you in the process, so long as my needs are met. It just makes me look good to give you even more. Distributive kind of negotiating is really about a limited pie theory. This is the idea that there's only so much resources to go around, and the more that I get, the less that you get. So you can see with multiple issues in a negotiation, like a large negotiation, you can bounce back and forth between being integrative, where you're adding value to the situation, or distributive, where you're just trying to take as much as you can grab. Some other tools for managing conflict: you might want to separate people from the problem. Say, okay, this is the problem. Don't get involved with whether or not you like the person. Just deal with the problem. Focus on interest is extremely important in all aspects of negotiation. What's an interest? An interest is actually what's motivating the person to ask for or demand what they want. If you go with that, there are a lot of other options for meeting their needs than just what they think is in front of them, what they're actually asking for. Generating a multitude of alternatives to choose from can be very helpful, and insisting that results be objective or have objective standards. In other words, things that are measurable. Lastly, when it comes to team leadership, you have to look at work team effectiveness. How well is a team doing? As a whole, individually, people might be doing quite well, but if the team isn't doing well, if the team isn't getting to where it needs to go, that could be a rather large problem. All right, so what are some of the different ways in which we measure teamwork effectiveness? Well, we measure it as a productive output. In other words, how well do we do as a team? What can we measure? How well does the sales do? How well does a service team do? Things like that. What about satisfaction of members, the actual members within the team? Do they feel that the team is working well together? And lastly, the capacity to adapt and learn. Does a team do very well in different situations, new markets, when it comes across conflict with other teams, when it comes across situations where policies are in conflict, within the organization or within the team itself if members are in conflict. All right, and that is it for Chapter 18, Teamwork Effectiveness.